It was the kind of lake that didn't need an Instagram filter. Glassy water stretched wide, still as a photograph, framed by pine trees that whispered in the breeze. Ducks floated lazily by. You could hear the occasional slap of a fish breaking the surface, and if you were lucky, the far-off whistle of a train rolling through the valley. For one man, this place wasn't just a getaway, it was a sanctuary. Years ago, when life was heavier and the world a little too loud, he and his father had cut and stacked the timbers that built a small cabin here. Rough-hewn logs, a tin roof that sang when it rained, and a wraparound porch where you could drink coffee while the mist burned off the lake. Every board carried sweat, memory, and the kind of pride you only get from building something with your own two hands. Now most weekends you'd find him right there, fishing rod propped up, boots kicked onto the porch rail, sipping a cold drink and watching the sun melt over the water. He didn't ask for much. No crowds, no traffic, just peace. But one morning, that peace was broken. He stepped out of the cabin, stretched and froze. Something was wrong. His lawn, his little stretch of heaven, wasn't empty. Dozens of bright orange flags stabbed into the grass, sticking up in neat little rows like some kind of invasion. They ran in a straight line down to the lake, cutting right through the middle of his property, and disappeared into the water. He blinked. What in the world? At first he thought maybe the county had made a mistake, some utility crew getting the wrong parcel. But as he walked closer, he saw the tags fluttering in the breeze. They weren't county markers. They had HOA property line written in bold Sharpie letters. That's when he heard it, the sound of a voice he already dreaded. "Oh, good, you're awake." Standing across the road was Karen, the newly crowned president of the Homeowners Association. Clipboard tucked under her arm, oversized sunglasses hiding half her face, and that smug smile plastered on like she'd just solved world hunger. Behind her, a handful of neighbors had gathered, whispering, nodding, staring at his cabin like it was some kind of problem that needed fixing. Karen waved like she owned the place. "We've got exciting news." Exciting news. His heart sank. He didn't like the tone of her voice. Karen marched forward, tapping her pen on the clipboard as if it were a judge's gavel. "We're marking out the new community lake path, and lucky you, it runs right through here." The man laughed, actually laughed out loud. He thought it had to be some kind of joke. "Through here, lady, this is my yard." Karen's smile tightened, the way it does when someone isn't used to being told no. Technically, the lake belongs to everyone. The neighborhood needs access, and your cabin happens to be in the most scenic spot. His laughter died instantly. He glanced back at the cabin at the porch where he and his father once sat after long days of hammering nails. At the dock where his little niece had caught her first fish. Scenic spot? This wasn't a backdrop for a walking trail. This was his home. "You're out of your mind," he muttered. Karen scribbled something on her clipboard and didn't even look up. "We voted last week. Majority rules." He felt his blood boil. Majority rules? Since when did a mob vote erase private property lines? Before he could even argue, a neighbor shouted from the street, "Karen, is the bulldozer still coming tomorrow?" The man's jaw dropped. Bulldozer. Karen adjusted her sunglasses and smiled wider. Of course, progress waits for no one. He stared at her, stunned, silent, watching as she turned her back and rallied the crowd with promises of picnic tables, bike racks, and sunset strolls, all at the cost of his cabin. And in that moment, with orange flags dotting his yard like a battlefield, he realized something chilling. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't confusion. This was war. And let me ask you right now, if you woke up tomorrow and found strangers had planted flags in your yard, claiming their walking trail ran through your house, what would you do? Let me know in the comments, because this man's next move, it'll set off a chain reaction nobody saw coming. Sunday mornings at the lake were supposed to be calm. Coffee steaming in the mug, bacon sizzling in the pan, and maybe a lazy cast off the dock before the day warmed up. That's how it was supposed to be. But that Sunday, the man couldn't even sip his coffee without hearing a voice he'd learned to dread. "Good morning, neighbors," Karen's voice blasted through a megaphone she didn't need. She stood on the clubhouse lawn like a general addressing her troops, clipboard in one hand, oversized sunglasses hiding half her face. The entire neighborhood had gathered around her in a little crowd, Lawn chairs, picnic blankets, even kids holding balloons like this was a festival instead of a hostile takeover. The man leaned against his porch rail, jaw tight, watching. He already knew this wasn't going to be good. Karen cleared her throat theatrically and spread her arms wide, the way preachers do right before the sermon. As president of the HOA, I am thrilled to announce the Community Lake Path Project. The crowd erupted in polite applause. Some neighbors even whooped. One guy in a polo clapped like he was at a rock concert. The man narrowed his eyes. Community Lake Path, he didn't like the sound of it. Karen beamed. This path will run directly from the neighborhood entrance straight through the shore, right along the most beautiful part of the lake. And then, like it was nothing, she pointed. Right through there. Her finger landed on his cabin. The man nearly spit out his coffee. "Excuse me," he muttered under his breath, loud enough that his hound dog tilted its head at him. Neighbors craned their necks to follow Karen's finger. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. They weren't staring at just the trees or the water. No, they were staring at his porch, his roof, his chimney. Karen tapped her clipboard. "Now, I know some of you have expressed concerns, but let me assure you, progress is never easy. We all must make sacrifices for the greater good. This path will increase property values, boost community pride, and give us direct lake access without," she paused for dramatic effect, "trespassing on private docks." The man's blood pressure spiked. Private docks? Lady, the only dock she was talking about was his. He stormed a few steps down his porch and shouted, "That's my land, my cabin." Karen didn't even flinch. She raised her sunglasses like a queen acknowledging a peasant and said sweetly, "Correction, it's our community's vision." The crowd murmured again, and suddenly it was like a bad dream. Neighbors he'd lent tools to, people he'd helped jump their cars in winter, were nodding along with Karen's words, hypnotized, convinced. The man shook his head. "You can't be serious." Karen smiled wider. "We're more than serious, we're committed." The board voted unanimously. "Voted," he barked back. "You can't vote away someone's house." But she just scribbled something on her clipboard and kept smiling. "Majority rules." And that's when he heard the sound that made his stomach drop, the low rumble of diesel. He turned his head, and sure enough, there it was, parked at the edge of the cul-de-sac. A bulldozer, big, yellow, its steel blade gleaming in the morning sun like a weapon. He blinked hard. Surely this was a bluff. Surely they would. But Karen clapped her hands like a cheerleader. "Ladies and gentlemen, demolition begins tomorrow morning. By this time next week, we'll be strolling along our brand new lake path." The neighbors clapped and cheered. Some even popped open soda cans like it was a tailgate. The man clenched his fists. His cabin wasn't just a building. It was his father's sweat, his childhood summers, his peace in a chaotic world. And this woman, this clipboard tyrant, wanted to erase it for community access. He took a deep breath, trying to hold back the fire rising in his chest. But when Karen strutted down the street, megaphone in hand, waving at him like she was the mayor, he couldn't help it. He shouted across the yard, "You touch my cabin, and you're gonna regret it." Karen just chuckled, scribbled something else on her clipboard, and said, "Oh, you'll thank us when you see how nice the path looks." And with that, she turned on her heel, leading her parade of neighbors back down the road. The man stood there on his porch, jaw set, eyes locked on that bulldozer. The sun was high, the lake shimmered as always, but nothing felt peaceful anymore. Tomorrow morning wasn't going to bring a sunrise. Tomorrow morning was going to bring destruction. And I'll ask you right here, if a bulldozer rolled up to your front yard, backed by neighbors cheering for your home to be destroyed, what would you do? Drop your answer in the comments, because what happens tomorrow morning, well, let's just say you won't see it coming. The morning sun hadn't even burned the mist off the lake when the diesel engine growled to life. The sound rattled windows and shook birds from the trees. The man was already awake, sitting on his porch with his phone in hand, recording. He wanted evidence. Every nail, every plank, every violation, they were all going on video. At the end of the street, Karen stood in her usual battle armor. Oversized sunglasses, clipboard clutched like a holy relic, lips painted a shade too bold for a Sunday morning. Around her gathered half the neighborhood. Some brought folding chairs, some had coffee in styrofoam cups. One even brought a cooler like this was a sporting event. They weren't neighbors anymore, they were spectators. The bulldozer rumbled forward. Its steel claw glinted in the sunlight, and the man's stomach churned. "Stop," he shouted, stepping off his porch. "This is private property, you can't touch this cabin." Karen cupped her hands around her mouth, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Sir, we voted. It's community property now. Step aside." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Lady, a vote doesn't erase a deed." Karen rolled her eyes and waved at the operator. "Go ahead." The bulldozer lurched. Its treads chewed into the grass, flattening the orange flags that had sprouted overnight. Neighbors leaned forward in their seats, kids bouncing on their knees. It was a show, and his cabin was the star attraction. The machine's claw reached the porch first. Wood splintered like toothpicks. The rocking chair where he'd watched 100 sunsets shattered into a pile of broken legs and arms. Glass from the windows cracked and fell in a glittering shower. Every crunch echoed in his chest like a hammer. This wasn't just a structure coming down, it was memories, sweat, his father's laugh, his family's legacy. And the worst part, they were cheering. Karen clapped her hands. "That's it, progress, people, this is what progress looks like." The man raised his phone higher, voice steady though his hands trembled. "You're on camera, every single one of you. Hope you like starring in court." Some neighbors faltered, their smiles fatting just a touch. But Karen, she strutted right up to the rubble like a model on a runway, snapping selfies with the destruction behind her. She even threw up a peace sign. The bulldozer didn't stop until the cabin was a heap of timber and dust. The dock splintered under the machine's weight, snapping into the water. His fishing pole, still leaning where he'd left it, was crushed in an instant. Silence hung for just a moment after the final crash. Smoke rose from the heap. The lake shimmered like nothing had happened, mocking the ruin on its shore. Then Karen raised her megaphone and broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a pathway." The crowd erupted in cheers. A neighbor popped a soda can like champagne, spraying fizz into the air. Kids ran forward, climbing the rubble like it was a jungle gym. The man just stood there, phone still recording, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Not because he found this funny, no, far from it, but because he knew something Karen didn't, something none of them did. A neighbor nudged him, smirking. "What ray you grinning at, buddy? Looks like you just lost." The man lowered his phone and locked eyes with him. "Lost? No, they just handed me the win." The neighbor frowned, confused, but the man didn't explain. He didn't need to, not yet. Because while Karen was strutting in front of cameras, basking in her self-declared victory, the man was already planning his counterstrike. And when it landed, it wasn't going to just take back his cabin. It was going to take the heart of the HOA itself. And let me ask you this. If your home was flattened by a bulldozer, cheered on by your neighbors, what would your next move be? Would you walk away, or would you fight back? Let me know below, because in part 4, the papers he pulls out are about to turn this story completely upside down. The night after his cabin fell, the man sat at his kitchen table under a single buzzing light bulb. The smell of sawdust and diesel still clung to his clothes. His phone was packed with videos. Karen cheering, the bulldozer clawing, neighbors clapping like it was the 4th of July. But instead of watching them, he spread out a pile of papers across the table. Deeds, old ones yellowed at the edges, freshly notarized ones. Maps of the shoreline drawn up decades ago. Most people never look past the front page of their property papers. But him, he'd read every line years back, and he remembered what he saw. Karen thought she'd bulldozed her way to victory, but she had no idea he held the checkmate. He ran his hand over one particular deed, tracing the black ink. His late father had insisted they file it, even though nobody else cared about it at the time. "Someday," his father had said, "this little strip of land will matter." And tonight, it mattered. At sunrise, while Karen was probably still writing her community path grand opening email, the man drove into town. He parked at the county courthouse, grabbed his stack of papers, and walked inside. The clerk looked up from her coffee. "Morning," he said calmly, setting the stack on her counter. I need to confirm these property lines. The clerk flipped through the documents, eyes narrowing. She typed furiously into her computer. Minutes passed. She double-checked, then checked again. Finally, she looked up, her face serious. "Sir," she said, "not only do you own that cabin plot, you own the entire shoreline stretch around the lake. And this," she tapped one document with her fingernail, "this parcel here, that's listed as the land beneath the HOA's clubhouse." The man smiled slowly. "So the cabin they destroyed was mine, the path they claimed is mine, and the building where they hold their meetings," he leaned closer, "also mine." The clerk nodded, "Every inch of it." He thanked her, collected the papers, and walked out. For the first time in days, he breathed easy. The HOA thought they'd erased him, but really, they'd just bulldozed themselves straight into a legal trap. By noon, he'd filed his lawsuit. Video evidence attached, property deeds verified, claims of destruction of private property, trespassing, unlawful seizure, and damages. The whole 9 yards. That evening, as neighbors were sipping iced tea in lawn chairs on what they thought was their community path, a sheriff's deputy showed up with envelopes in hand. Karen, who was giving a tour of the rubble like it was a model home showcase, froze when the deputy cleared his throat. "HOA board, you've been served." Karen snatched the papers, scanned the first page, and her sunglasses slid down her nose. "What is this?" The deputy adjusted his hat. "A lawsuit, multiple counts, property destruction, fraud, and according to these records, you built your clubhouse on land that doesn't belong to you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Neighbors whispered. A few pulled out their phones, scrolling furiously as if the documents would vanish if they didn't see it for themselves. Karen's face turned red. These papers are fake. This is harassment." But the deputy shook his head. "No, ma'am, already verified by the county clerk, looks pretty airtight." The man leaned against a tree, arms folded, just watching. When Karen spotted him, she jabbed her finger in his direction. "You think this scares me? You won't win." He just smirked. "Karen, you already lost, you just don't know it yet." The crowd, once her cheerleaders, now looked uneasy. The same neighbors who had clapped when the bulldozer crushed his cabin were now muttering about lawsuits, fines, and wait. Did we just cheer for a crime? The man turned and walked back toward his truck. He didn't need to say more. The papers spoke louder than any megaphone ever could. "And let me throw this to you. Have you ever caught someone waving fake authority in your face, only to later prove them wrong with the real receipts? Drop your story in the comments, because in Part 5, the HOA's meltdown is about to turn neighbors against each other in a way even Karen can't control. The lawsuit hit the neighborhood like a summer storm, fast, loud, and impossible to ignore. At first, the HOA board tried to brush it off. Karen strutted from porch to porch in her tennis visor, telling anyone who'd listen that it was just paperwork, and that the community fund will cover it. But the neighbors weren't so sure anymore. The deputy's words echoed in their heads. The clubhouse isn't even on HOA property. If that was true, then whose land had they been paying dues to maintain? And worse, where was their money going? The man didn't have to lift a finger. The cracks were forming all on their own. By the following week, the community path that had once been filled with lawn chairs and lemonade cups was now filled with arguments. Couples whispered heatedly. Friends who used to barbecue together crossed the street without waving, and at the center of it all stood Karen, trying to hold her little empire together with nothing but denial and shouting. At the next HOA meeting, things exploded. It started in the clubhouse. Yes, his clubhouse, that the board still dared to use. Folding chairs were packed shoulder to shoulder, voices buzzing louder than the old ceiling fan spinning above. Karen slammed her gavel on the table. "Order, this meeting will come to order." But no one listened. One man shot up from his chair. "You told us he didn't own this land, Karen. You said it was community property. Now we find out you bulldozed a cabin that wasn't yours to touch. You've put us all in danger." A woman in the back chimed in. "My husband looked at the county website. It matches his paperwork exactly. Karen, you lied." Karen's jaw clenched. "I did not lie. I was acting in the best interest of this neighborhood." That's when another voice cut through, sharp, cold. Best interest or your interest? All eyes turned. It was Tom, her own board treasurer. He stood with a manila folder in his hands, his face pale but resolute. "Tell them, Karen," he said, his voice trembling. "Tell them where the dues went." Karen's eyes widened. "Tom, don't you dare." But it was too late. Tom pulled out a stack of papers, holding them up for all to see. "I've been keeping records. Half of what we collected this year never went to landscaping or maintenance. It went straight into accounts Karen controlled, personal accounts." The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, and even a few curses flew through the air. Karen slammed her gavel again, harder this time. "That's a lie, fabricated. He's jealous because I wouldn't let him run the summer parade." But no one believed her anymore. They surged to their feet, shouting over one another. Some demanded refunds. Others called for Karen to resign. A few even stormed toward the door, muttering about calling lawyers of their own. Karen's control was slipping like sand through her fingers. And then, just when it seemed the chaos couldn't get louder, the man appeared. He leaned casually in the doorway, arms crossed, not saying a word. His presence was enough. The room fell into a hush, like someone had pressed mute on a screaming television. Karen's face went white. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. He raised an eyebrow, "Checking in on my clubhouse." His voice was calm, but every syllable cut sharp. "Looks like you're having management issues." The crowd turned toward him, eyes wide. Suddenly, the board's power seemed flimsy compared to the weight of the man standing there with deeds in his pocket and the law on his side. Karen gripped her gavel so tight her knuckles turned white. "You're not welcome here." The man smirked. "Funny, because by law I'm the only one who is welcome here." The silence that followed was deafening. Neighbors looked from Karen to him, and for the first time, many realized the truth. Their so-called leader had dragged them into a war they could never win. He gave them a long, steady look, then stepped back into the night without another word. He didn't need to stay. The cracks were already widening, and soon the HOA would collapse under its own weight. And here's something to chew on. Have you ever seen someone cling to power even when the ground beneath them was crumbling? Drop your story in the comments. Because in part 6, Karen's desperation is about to push her into a move so reckless, it shocks even her most loyal followers. Karen didn't sleep that night. While the rest of the neighborhood whispered about lawsuits, missing dues, and whether their leader had just sunk them all, she sat in her kitchen with the blinds drawn, staring at a half-empty glass of boxed wine. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Texts from angry neighbors, missed calls from board members, emails piling up faster than she could delete them. And through it all, one thought gnawed at her. She was losing. The man's smug face at the clubhouse door replayed in her mind again and again. He hadn't shouted, hadn't even threatened. Just stood there, calm, confident, unshakable. That silence burned her worse than any words could have, because deep down she knew he had won. But Karen wasn't the type to surrender. She built her identity on control, on rules, on power over this neighborhood. If she lost that, she lost everything. So she hatched a plan, a reckless, wild plan, the kind of plan that might burn down everything around her, but maybe, just maybe, leave her standing on the ashes. By morning, she was in action. She marched door to door, clipboard in hand, telling anyone who answered that the man's documents were fake, that he had tricked the county, and that he was a professional con artist. Some neighbors still wanted to believe her. Others slammed the door in her face. But Karen didn't care. She only needed a few loyal ones, and by the time the sun set, she had them. A ragtag cluster of die-hard HOA loyalists who clung to her like moths to a flame. That night, she gathered them at the path by the lake. Flashlights bobbed in the dark as she whispered her plan. "We take it back tonight, before he tries anything else. If he owns the clubhouse on paper, fine. Then we use the land. We'll clear the rest of the shoreline and cut a new path bigger than before. He can't sue us all. He won't dare." One man hesitated. "Karen, isn't that trespassing?" She snapped, "It's our community. We're fighting for what's ours." And with that, she revved up a rented skid-steer loader she'd somehow convinced the local hardware store to release on her credit card. Its headlights glared across the lakefront, cutting through the darkness. Her little posse followed with chainsaws, shovels, and even a weed torch. The air buzzed with a mix of fear and adrenaline. They weren't just defying the man now, they were daring him to stop them. But they weren't alone. From the tree line across the water, headlights flared, two trucks idling on the shoreline. Their engines rumbled low, steady, like a warning growl. And standing in front of them, silhouetted against the beams, was the man himself. He didn't move, didn't shout. He just stood there, arms crossed, as if waiting to see how far Karen would go. Karen's face twisted with fury. She yanked the skid steer forward, its metal bucket biting into the soil near the lake's edge. Dirt flew, roots snapped. "See," she shouted over the engine. "He can't stop us, this is our land." But then crunch. The skid steer jolted hard, the bucket snagging on something beneath the dirt. Sparks flew. The engine sputtered, groaned, then died. The machine sat lifeless, tilted at an angle. Karen cursed, slamming her fists on the controls. Her followers shifted uneasily, their bravado draining with the hum of the silenced engine. The man finally stepped forward, slow and deliberate. His boots crunched on the gravel as he came into the glow of their flashlights. His voice was steady, cold as stone. "You just crossed into my property line. Again." No one breathed. He pointed behind them. A sheriff's cruiser had rolled up silently, red and blue lights flashing in the night. Another followed close behind. Deputies stepped out, hands on their belts, flashlights sweeping the scene. Karen froze, her face pale under the harsh beams. This isn't what it looks like," she stammered. "We're just—" The man cut her off, his voice slicing through the chaos. "No, Karen, it's exactly what it looks like." The deputies spread out, speaking into radios. One of them pulled out a notepad. Another shined a light directly at Karen, who sat frozen in the dead skid steer, hands trembling on the wheel. Her loyalists backed away, one by one, muttering excuses. Nobody wanted to be standing next to her when the law wrote its report. And just like that, Karen's army crumbled. The man didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just watched, letting the weight of her choices crush her under its own gravity. Now here, where it gets wild, the law was finally involved, but Karen wasn't done. Not yet. In Part 7, her next move would take the neighborhood into uncharted territory, where even the man himself would have to decide how far he was willing to go. The cruiser lights painted the lakefront in flashing red and blue. Neighbors peeked out from porches and bedroom windows, some holding phones high to record the spectacle. The night air hummed with whispers and gasps. Karen sat frozen in the dead skid steer, her hands gripping the useless levers like a captain refusing to leave a sinking ship. The deputies circled, their flashlights cutting across the shoreline, the torn earth, and the broken roots where her reckless digging had begun. One deputy, a tall man with a square jaw, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step down from that machine." Karen lifted her chin, eyes blazing. "This is HOA property. You can't order me around on community land." The deputy glanced at the man standing calmly a few feet away. The man reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded stack of papers, and handed them over without a word. The deputy shined his flashlight across the documents, his brows knitting together. Then he let out a long, slow whistle. "Well, that settles that." He turned to Karen, his voice firm. "This isn't community property, ma'am, it's his. And by the looks of it, you've just committed trespassing, vandalism, and unlawful use of machinery." The crowd murmured. Karen's loyalists, the few that hadn't already slipped into the shadows, took a step back. Nobody wanted to share in the charges. Karen's face went crimson. "No, he forged those. He's tricking you all." But the deputy shook his head. "These were verified at the county office weeks ago. He's the landowner, and this path, this whole project you've been forcing, illegal." The silence was deafening. For the first time, the neighbors saw Karen not as their self-appointed leader, but as what she really was, an outlaw standing in the flashing lights, cornered by her own arrogance. The deputy moved closer. "Step down now, ma'am." Karen's chest heaved. She scanned the crowd of faces, neighbors who once cheered for her, board members who once bowed to her every decision. Now they stared at her with cold, distant eyes. No loyalty left, no protection. And that's when Karen made her last desperate move. With a sudden lunge, she yanked a folder from her bag, waving it like a torch. "You think he owns this land? Think again, I have proof." The deputies froze. The man narrowed his eyes. Karen flipped open the folder, pulling out sheet after sheet of papers. HOA meeting minutes, signatures, stamped documents. She thrust them at the nearest flashlight. "Right here, this proves the board voted to seize the shoreline as easement. He can't own it, because we declared it ours." The crowd gasped. For a split second, it almost looked like Karen had found a loophole. Almost. But the man didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his voice steady. "Karen, those aren't legal filings. They're HOA notes. A club can't vote to steal private property. You might as well have written it on napkins." The deputy scanned the papers, then sighed. "He's right. None of this holds up in court. In fact," he pulled a sheet from the pile, holding it up to the cruiser's light. "Some of these signatures look off." The man leaned closer, his tone sharp. "Forged, aren't they?" The deputy nodded slowly. "Looks that way." Karen's face drained of color. "No, that's not no." She snatched at the papers, but the deputy pulled them back, slipping them into an evidence bag. Whispers surged through the crowd. Forgery, fraud, words that carried more weight than any HOA bylaw. The man let the silence stretch, then finally spoke. "You destroyed my cabin, you stole from your neighbors, you trespassed on land you never owned, and now this." He shook his head. "You've burned every bridge, Karen." The deputies moved in, one on each side. Karen thrashed, shouting at the crowd. "Don't let them do this. I did it for all of you, for the community. You'll regret this when he takes everything." But nobody moved. Not a single neighbor stepped forward to defend her. And as the deputies guided her away, the man caught her eye one last time. She glared back at him with a hatred so fierce it could have lit the night. Yet beneath it, there was fear, raw, undeniable fear. Because she knew. This wasn't just a battle lost. This was the end game. But here's the kicker. The HOA wasn't finished yet. Karen's arrest was only the beginning. In Part 8, the courtroom drama would flip everything on its head, and the final twist would leave the entire neighborhood reeling. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and old dust. Rows of neighbors filled the benches, whispering nervously as the clerk called the case. The HOA versus the man, Karen versus everyone. Karen shuffled in, wrists free now but face pale, eyes darting like a trapped animal. She'd posted bail, but her arrogance was cracked. Even her trademark tennis visor was gone, replaced with a messy bun and deep shadows under her eyes. The man sat across the aisle, calm as ever. He wasn't dressed like a warrior or even like someone seeking revenge. Just a clean shirt, jacket, and the same steady eyes that never wavered. Beside him, his lawyer quietly stacked the documents, the deeds, the maps, the forged signatures, the bank records. The case was airtight. The judge entered and the room stood. Karen shifted in her seat, wringing her hands. For once, she didn't look like the queen of the neighborhood. She looked small. Her lawyer tried to argue. He waved the HOA minutes, claimed community easement, muttered about bylaws. But every time the judge cut him short. HOA authority, he said flatly, does not override county property deeds. You cannot seize what you do not own. When the forged signatures came out, the courtroom gasped. The forensic examiner testified in calm, clinical tones. These were copied, traced, altered, clear case of fraud. Karen tried to interrupt. That's a lie, I was framed, but the judge's gavel cracked like thunder. Enough. And then came the neighbors. One by one they took the stand. Some trembled, others burned with anger. They spoke of dues that vanished, fines invented, threats scribbled on yellow slips shoved into mailboxes. She fined me for having a blue flower pot, one woman said, voice shaking. $50 for a flower pot. She shut down my son's lemonade stand, another added. Said it was an unlicensed business. She told me if I didn't vote her way, she'd foreclose on my house. An older man said, eyes misting. The room buzzed with outrage. By the time the last witness stepped down, the HOA's power looked less like leadership and more like a shakedown racket. Corinne's face was stone, but her hands trembled. Finally, the judge turned to the man. "Do you wish to make a statement?" He rose slowly, every eye in the courtroom tracking him. His voice was calm even, but it carried to the farthest bench. "I didn't ask for any of this. I bought land. I built a cabin. They destroyed it for their convenience. I could have stayed quiet, let it go, but if I did, they'd just keep taking from others. This isn't about one cabin. It's about power abused, about neighbors bullied, about a board that thought it was above the law." He looked straight at Corinne, and for the first time her eyes dropped. Then he turned back to the judge. "All I ask is that justice be done, not just for me, for everyone they've wronged." The judge's gavel came down. Verdict in favor of the plaintiff. A ripple of relief swept through the benches. Some neighbors even clapped before the bailiff hushed them. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, due to fraudulent actions and misappropriation of funds, this court orders the dissolution of the HOA board effective immediately. Remaining funds will be audited and restitution paid to affected homeowners. As for the clubhouse, the judge adjusted his glasses. It remains the legal property of the plaintiff. The room exploded. The man didn't smile, didn't pump his fist. He just nodded once, the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew patience had paid off. Corinne, on the other hand, collapsed into her chair. Her lawyer whispered frantically, but she just stared at the floor, lips trembling. And here came the twist. As the crowd filed out, the man stayed behind. He walked to the clerk's desk and handed over a sealed envelope. The clerk looked confused. The man simply said, "File it with the property records." A week later, the neighbors got the news. The man hadn't just won the case. He'd signed the clubhouse over to a nonprofit youth program, free of charge. The very building Corinne used to rule like a throne would now echo with kids' laughter, basketball games, and community events open to everyone. That was the real revenge, not just beating Corinne, but transforming her kingdom into something better. Corinne, meanwhile, faced her own storm: fraud charges, restitution orders, and a neighborhood that now crossed the street to avoid her. The queen bee of the cul-de-sac was nothing more than a bitter memory. The man rebuilt his cabin by the lake, stronger this time, overlooking the shoreline that was always his. Neighbors stopped by often, not to demand or to fine, but to thank him. To sit on the porch, share coffee, and breathe in the peace Corinne had stolen from them for so long. And here's the question for you. Have you ever seen someone lose everything because they pushed too far, because they thought the rules didn't apply to them? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. And don't forget to hit that like button if you've been rooting for the cabin owner since the start, because this isn't the last time an HOA bully gets put in their place. The man leaned back in his rocking chair as the sun set over the water, the lake calm, the clubhouse full of life. Justice wasn't just served, it was carved in stone. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.